If you have ever looked at something you bought recently and felt a strange emptiness almost immediately after you are not alone. Maybe it was convenient. Maybe it was attractive. Maybe everyone around you seemed to treat it as normal. And yet somewhere underneath the purchase, there was a quieter question. Was that really worth it? By 2026, that question has become more psychologically important than it first appears. Because when people talk about what is worth the money, they often speak as if worth is objective, as if value lives inside the object itself. But in lived experience, value is rarely just about the object. It is about the emotional contract you unconsciously enter when you pay for something. You are not only buying function, you are buying relief, identity, convenience, belonging, status, hope. And sometimes what stops being worth your money is not the thing itself. It is the emotional burden attached to it, the silent pressure, the recurring maintenance, the way it asks you to keep performing a version of yourself long after the initial excitement has faded. So this is not a list about deprivation. It is a psychological map of 12 things that for many people are no longer worth what they cost emotionally, mentally, and symbolically in 2026. The first is status purchases that exist mainly to reassure other people. The expensive item that says you are doing well. The upgraded version that signals competence. The polished object that makes your life look more stable than it feels. These purchases are rarely irrational in the simple sense. They often emerge from social comparison, which the brain is wired to monitor automatically. Human beings are deeply sensitive to status cues because status has long been tied to safety, inclusion, and survival. To be seen as falling behind can activate shame far more quickly than logic. So the mind learns to buy symbols that reduce the discomfort of feeling exposed. But what used to feel like a shortcut to self-protection now often becomes a recurring tax on identity. Because once an object is doing emotional work, it stops being just an object. It becomes a prop. And props are expensive to maintain. The second is convenience spending that quietly replaces self-trust. By 2026, friction has become one of the most monetized experiences in modern life. Faster delivery, fewer steps, less waiting, less effort, less discomfort. On the surface, this seems harmless. But psychologically constant convenience trains the nervous system to become less tolerant of ordinary delay. And when tolerance weakens, discomfort begins to feel urgent. This is how small conveniences can become large dependencies, not because ease is bad, but because the brain adapts quickly. What begins as occasional support can become an expectation. And then, the absence of convenience starts to feel like deprivation even when nothing essential is missing. The money is not only paying for speed, it is paying to prevent frustration, boredom, uncertainty, or effort from being felt. The third is subscriptions you no longer consciously choose. This is one of the clearest examples of passive psychological drift. The modern consumer environment is built to move decisions out of awareness. Once the payment becomes invisible, the relationship becomes emotionally muted. You stop asking whether you still care. You stop evaluating whether it still matters. It remains not because it is meaningful, but because cancellation requires attention. And attention is scarce when life already feels cognitively full. So the monthly charge continues, not because it serves you, but because your mental bandwidth is being quietly rented by everything else. The fourth is algorithm-driven impulse buying. Not simply random shopping, but the highly engineered moment where your mood, your vulnerability, and your exposure to suggestion intersect. This kind of spending often appears small enough to dismiss. But behaviorally, it matters because it trains a loop. You feel tension. You encounter stimulation. You anticipate relief. You purchase. For a brief moment, the brain receives dopamine not from possession, but from the interruption of unease. This is why so many purchases feel most satisfying before they even arrive. Anticipation is powerful, sometimes more powerful than ownership. And when your emotional system learns that scrolling can lead to soothing, the purchase is no longer about the item. It becomes a regulation ritual. The fifth is paying to maintain an identity you have outgrown. This may be the lifestyle that fit the person you were trying to become, the routine that once made you feel impressive, the aesthetic that used to give structure to your self-image. But identity is not static. And one of the more painful financial experiences is continuing to fund a self that no longer feels real. The gym membership tied to guilt, the wardrobe tied to an old professional mask, the social habits tied to belonging in a group you no longer feel close to. Sometimes the money remains because letting go feels like failure. But often what you are actually grieving is not the expense. It is the version of you that expense once supported. The sixth is paying premium prices for chronic overstimulation. Many people are no longer just buying products. They are buying noise disguised as reward. Too many options, too much speed, too much novelty, too much access. In behavioral terms, overstimulation can dysregulate reward sensitivity. When everything is bright, immediate, and emotionally charged, the nervous system becomes more reactive and less satisfied. This creates a strange paradox. The more stimulation you buy, the less deeply you enjoy it. And that matters, because a life full of consumption can still feel emotionally unfed. The seventh is food experiences and little luxuries, used primarily to compensate for emotional depletion. This is not about pleasure. Pleasure matters. It is about the difference between enjoyment and compensation. When the nervous system is under prolonged stress, it begins to seek rapid forms of relief. Sugar delivery meals treats small upgrades, ambient indulgences. These can all become emotionally loaded. Not because they are inherently excessive, but because they start functioning as private rescue signals. After a hard day, the purchase says at least this, at least something, at least one moment that belongs to me. And that makes perfect psychological sense. But when relief becomes the main thing being purchased, the object itself becomes secondary. What you are paying for is a temporary softening of inner pressure. The difficulty is that temporary softening does not resolve the underlying depletion. So the pattern repeats, again and again. Not always dramatically, often quietly. A sequence of small emotional reimbursements that slowly lose their power to restore. The eighth is social spending that exists to prevent awkwardness. The dinner you cannot comfortably enjoy because half of your attention is on what it costs. The gift chosen less from warmth than from fear of seeming inadequate. The trip, the event, the round of drinks, the unspoken agreement to keep up. So much modern spending is organized around the avoidance of embarrassment. And embarrassment, for the social brain, is not a small thing. It can feel like danger. Human beings are highly responsive to cues of acceptance and exclusion. We monitor faces, tones, reactions, and subtle signals of rank constantly. This means money often becomes a tool not just for getting things, but for smoothing social risk. You pay to avoid the pause, to avoid the explanation, to avoid being the one who says no. But over time, that creates a hidden cost, because when money is used to preserve social comfort at the expense of internal honesty, the self begins to split. Outward ease, inward tension. You look relaxed while privately calculating. You appear generous while quietly resenting the pressure. And that split is exhausting. The ninth is products sold as self-improvement when they are really selling self-correction. This category has become especially powerful because it speaks to a deep vulnerability. The fear that you are behind, flawed, undisciplined, or not yet enough. The purchase promises optimization, transformation, reinvention. It offers not just utility, but redemption. Buy this and become more focused. Wear this and become more desirable. Use this and become the version of yourself you keep failing to be. This works because shame is profitable. When people feel fundamentally insufficient, they become more willing to spend on symbolic repair. And in 2026, the marketplace is exceptionally skilled at turning insecurity into subscription models, branded routines, and aesthetic identities. The promise is never only improvement. It is relief from self-discomfort. But anything built on self-rejection tends to become expensive, not only financially, psychologically, because the purchase keeps reinforcing the same premise that the current self is unacceptable. The 10th is anything that forces you to keep escalating just to feel normal. This is one of the quietest traps in consumer culture. The baseline keeps shifting. What once felt special becomes ordinary. What once felt premium becomes standard. And then the next upgrade appears not as luxury, but as the new minimum. This is how adaptation works. The brain normalizes quickly, especially in environments saturated with comparison and novelty. So the cycle continues, not because you are uniquely materialistic, but because your reward system was never designed for infinite exposure to better, newer, faster, shinier alternatives. In earlier environments, comparison was smaller in scale. Now, it is constant. You are not just comparing with neighbors or colleagues. You are comparing with curated lifestyles, ambient wealth signals, and algorithmically selected images of what a life is supposed to look like when it is going well. Under those conditions, enough becomes unstable. And when enough becomes unstable, almost anything can start to feel worth the money in the moment, until the moment passes. The 11th is paying to avoid being alone with your own mind. This may sound abstract, but it shapes more consumer behavior than people realize. Sometimes spending fills silence. Sometimes it fills the emptiness after work. Sometimes it protects against the discomfort of stillness, where anxiety, grief, uncertainty, or self-doubt might rise to the surface. Consumption can become a way of keeping the internal world busy enough not to be felt. A package to anticipate. A screen to scroll, a product to research, a cart to build, a tiny future event to look forward to. The transaction gives shape to time, and that is part of its power. It is not always the thing you want. Sometimes it is the temporary occupation of consciousness. The 12th is anything you continue paying for out of inertia, even after the meaning has gone. This is where emotional honesty becomes important, because many expenses do not stay in your life due to joy, usefulness, or care. They stay because endings are psychologically difficult. Canceling can feel like admitting you were wrong. Letting go can feel like loss. Stopping can create a small identity vacuum. So the payment continues not because the thing still matters, but because you have not fully metabolized the truth that it no longer does. And this is where money becomes a mirror, not a moral test. A mirror. It reflects what you fear losing, what you are trying to protect, what version of yourself you are funding, what discomfort you are repeatedly trying not to feel. When you start to see spending this way, the question changes. It is no longer only, is this expensive? It becomes, what is this purchase being asked to do? Inside me, that is a different kind of awareness, and often a gentler one, because many people carry unnecessary shame around what they spend on as if every regretted purchase proves they are careless, impulsive, or weak. But behavior is rarely that simple. Most spending patterns are not random. They are adaptive. They emerge from a nervous system trying to create relief-structured dignity or social safety with the tools available to it. The expensive coffee is sometimes about pause. The upgrade is sometimes about self-respect. The delivery meal is sometimes about exhaustion. The subscription is sometimes about fantasy. The social spending is sometimes about belonging. The polished object is sometimes about protection from shame. Once you understand that the moral drama begins to soften, this does not make every purchase wise, but it does make it intelligible. And intelligibility matters, because what you understand, you no longer need to judge so harshly. For many people, the deepest shift in 2026 is not learning to want less in some forced or performative way. It is beginning to notice how often money has been used as a translator for emotional needs that were never named directly. Safety becomes a product. Rest becomes a service. Identity becomes a brand. Hope becomes a checkout button. And the more emotionally overloaded a culture becomes, the easier it is for the marketplace to sell people reflections of their own unmet needs, not because people are foolish, because they are human. A tired person is more suggestible. An ashamed person is more persuadable. A lonely person is more responsive to symbolic inclusion. An anxious person is more drawn to anything that promises immediate resolution. This is why consumer behavior cannot be understood only through logic. Logic matters, but logic is often the last voice to arrive. Emotion gets there first. Conditioning gets there first. Memory gets there first. The body gets there first. Then the mind constructs a reason. So perhaps what is no longer worth your money in 2026 is anything that repeatedly asks you to betray your own inner reality in exchange for a temporary emotional arrangement. Anything that makes you look calm while feeling more strained. Anything that makes you appear successful while feeling more fragile. Anything that offers relief but quietly deepens dependence. Anything that keeps you performing a self that costs too much to maintain. Because the true cost of a purchase is not always visible on the receipt. Sometimes the real cost is the pressure it adds, the identity it locks you into, the comparison it feeds, the silence it postpones, the nervous system pattern it strengthens, and sometimes what looks affordable financially is deeply expensive psychologically. This is why two people can buy the same thing and experience completely different forms of value. One person buys from enjoyment. Another buys from fear. One buys from alignment. Another buys from social tension. One feels complete after the purchase. Another feels briefly sedated, then vaguely diminished. The object is the same. The inner contract is different. That may be one of the most important things to remember. Money is rarely only about money. It is also about the meanings wrapped around it, the memories attached to it, the future it promises, the shame it temporarily hides, the self it allows you to impersonate, and sometimes the self it prevents you from actually meeting. So, if certain things no longer feel worth your money, even if the culture still insists they should, that does not necessarily mean you are becoming restrictive, cynical, or disconnected. It may mean your perception is becoming more honest. You may be noticing that not everything which creates stimulation creates nourishment. Not everything which signals success creates peace. Not everything which offers convenience creates freedom. Not everything which looks like self-improvement creates self-trust. Some things cost too much because they keep you emotionally outsourced. And there is a quiet dignity in beginning to see that, not as a rule, not as a performance of restraint, but as a form of psychological clarity. Because once you recognize that a purchase was never really about the object, you start to see your own behavior with more precision and less shame. You realize that you were not simply chasing things. You were often trying to regulate a state, protect an identity, soothe an old fear, preserve belonging in a world that attaches so much meaning to visible choices. That understanding does not solve everything, but it changes the atmosphere around the question. And sometimes that is where a healthier relationship with money really begins. Not in control, not in guilt, not in discipline for its own sake, but in awareness, quiet, accurate awareness, the kind that lets you look at what you are drawn to, what you keep paying for, and what no longer truly gives back what it asks from you. And from there, something subtle becomes possible. Not a perfect life, not a purified one, just a more honest one.